with the first bulkhead completed, and I'm quite happy with it. It's quite a nice, colourful bit of front end there, really, isn't it? And it contrasts nicely with what we've done on the floor, and it'll contrast with what we're going to do on the side piece here. But what I wanted to do is just test fit it into the fuselage half and make sure everything lines up. I've got to say, the fit is absolutely superb. So, I mean, that's just held in. Obviously, it's not glued in, and it's just sitting there. It just clicks into place. It really is a thing of beauty. So now we've fitted this front bulkhead, my attention is moving to this section here, these two bulkheads and this divider between them. Everything on that side is going to get closed off when we put the top of the fuselage on, but we have an opening here, so all of this you can look down into. So this is the next section, so we're going to work backwards, that bulkhead, that joining piece, that bulkhead, then we can put the dials on, and then we're on final bulkhead with the seat, but we've got some rigging to do, as you can see here, which I think is going to be a lot easier to do before we put the steering column in, the steering wheel in, I should say, because the column's already there, and the seat. And I think it's also going to be easier to do before we put these side pieces in the framework. So with all that in mind, let's crack on. I'm going to use US Modern Vehicle Wash. So it's an enamel wash, and I'm going to use that on here because it's brown with some green notes, and I think that's going to work nicely on here. So top tip with washes, don't limit them to what the title suggests that they should be. It's just a colour at the end of the day, so you can use that colour on anything where you think that colour works, really. So just going to go in with a detailing brush, and I've taken some of the dark material that collects in the cap, and we're going to start by doing the insides first, which is going to pick out the detail, and we want it a little bit darker in the background there. Let that run about. Now, I haven't put a varnish on this, so I know some people will be screaming at me, you should have sealed it first, it needs a clear coat. Yeah, whatever. But I'm not pin washing this, I'm covering the whole thing, and what I'm doing is I'm using the brush to direct where I want it to collect. So just keep revisiting the points where you want it to collect, allow the pigment to collect there. The whole thing will dry off, and it'll look fabulous, and we've not had to bother with an extra step that's time consuming while you wait for it to dry. So I do clear coat before I put washes down, but that tends to be if I'm doing a pin wash rather than an overall wash. As you can see, where I take the brush off is where the pigment collects, so I can now direct that pigment to where I want it to be. And because we're doing an all over wash, we need to key it in. And if we finish at the top there, that'll leave it a bit darker, and I can just blob it a bit at the bottom. And as it dries, what it's going to do is it's going to make the overall finish of the paint uneven, which gives you a nice variation. It's a bit like putting a filter on in a way, only you're not using the same colours as the original. There we go, and you can see we've got some detail there, and that's just going to help that pop out. Just going around the edges gives it a little bit of a used look. And I'm going to go back in with some more of the dark pigment from the cap and just darken this up a little bit. There we go, and that's all it needs. When that dries off, that'll look perfectly right. We can then matte coat it, paint in the metal fasteners on there, and then we can deal with putting some maps in it. time for a little bit of artistic license. We have a box here with a pipe coming out of it, and when I look at the paint instructions for the completed sub-assembly, so that is, let me just lift this up for you, here, you can see that it's hidden behind that bulkhead there. So you can see the box, but you can't see any of the pipe work. So there is actually no reference to what colour to do the pipe. Now, when we look at the rest of it, we can see that there is pipe work there. You can see just where the fire extinguisher is and the little red switch there. You can see there's a couple of pipes which are called out as M being white. And there's also a little pipe that goes from the dials, and I think that's all electrical pipe work that is in some way insulated, and therefore it's got some insulation tape or some product in there that is making it white. So my brain is telling me that we should paint it white, but there's also, if you look just the other side of the steering wheel, you've also got a pipe there that says P being copper. And I really quite like the idea of it being copper. So I'm going to spend a minute or two thinking about which way I'm going to go. I think I'm probably going to end up going white because I think that's going to contrast against the wood better. So there you go. As we're talking, I've convinced myself we're going to go white. So that's why we're doing it white, because it seems to tie in with everything else, but it'll contrast well, which is the real reason. Everything in the build that gets called out as being white, I'm using 7993, which is white grey. So it's an off-white or almost a very pale grey. And the reason is because we've got all this dark wood in there, if I paint it in a pure white, it's going to look very, very stark, and it's not going to be sympathetic. And it's, you know, how long does white stay white? It fades, it changes colour with UV light, it gets mucky from its environment, even if it's not being touched. So a pure white, I feel, would be wrong for this. So we're going to use the off-white because it's still going to look very white against all the dark wood and other colours that we've got going on in the build, which are all primarily sort of khakis and wood browns and muddy colours. So it is going to look quite bright against all that. So this should be fine, regardless of the fact that it's not, strictly speaking, a white, more of a pale grey. And you know, these thoughts on what is the right colour to use, it just comes from experience. You know, you build a model, you follow the instructions, you go, oh, that looks a bit bright, and you take a mental note, and then next time you go, actually, remember that such and such a built. Well, I don't want to do that again. So you do, you know, I see people asking the question, how do I build a model to a specific standard? In fact, someone asked Nigel at Nigel's Modelling Bench that question recently, and the answer is, it's experience. It's building and learning. You can't read it in a book. You can't really watch a YouTube video and go, right, now I know how to do that. You've got to do it and practice it, because your result might be different, your products might be different. So although watching what other people do is a great way of learning, the only way to actually learn is to do it. So there we go. Now you can see it doesn't look particularly white against this white primer here. And if I bring you into my palette, you can see the colour is definitely not white. So first thing I want to actually do is just remove some of this paint off here, just because that's going to be my gluing surface. Okay, that should be okay. Now let's just do a test fit. Okay, that goes on nicely. Actually, it goes on so nicely, I don't need glue. I can't get it off, so I'm going to leave it there. It will then glue into the floor plate, I think, so it will get locked into place. So that's our first part on. Now this one, we will be gluing on. Goes pretty much as high as you can. So the trick is going to be getting that square with that box, I think. Yeah. Okay. So you'll see that what I've tried to do is put the glue on the inside edge rather than on top, so that what will happen is when we put this on, gravity will let that glue come down and it'll sort of wick its way in and bond it all together. But the idea is we've reduced the risk of any glues oozing out. Not that anything is guaranteed in life, is it? Okay, that is our completed bulkhead. So we'll give that a moment to dry and we'll have a look at fitting some items on the next bulkhead while it dries. So I want to start by just test fitting this first bulkhead. So that fits in quite nicely, and I think it would be appropriate to just put the fuselage half there just to make sure that we're lining it up in place properly when we glue it. If we pop the floor into its location point, which is there, and then hold that in and we should be able to line this up. So there's a little peg you can just see there, and that has a location hole so that you know you're getting it all lined up correctly. There we go. So it's leaning tightly against our floor pan with actually a little bit of a gap. There's a bit of wiggle room there, so does it lean forward or does it lean back? Hard to know. My gut feeling is it should be against the flat edge there. Yeah. So I'm happy that I know what I'm doing-ish, and we can just glue that in. So I'm just going to give the surface a little scrape. We have avoided painting it in the main, but there's a little bit of overspray from the orange clear on there. So that should be okay now. I'm going to do this a bit differently. Rather than using the thicker glue, I'm going to use Plastic Magic, and we're going to give it a coat, leave it for a sec, and that's going to start biting into the plastic and making it sticky, and then we'll give it a second coat, which gives me a nice wet surface. So the second coat will dry a lot more slowly, and that gives me time to then place the part while still having a minimum amount of glue in play. Hold my floor pan in place. Make sure I'm nice and straight. Sorry for my hands, but my model is more important than your view. Right, there we go. First one in place, and whilst that's there, we can just try not to move it. We can look at putting this pipe into place. I can get at that from underneath, so again we'll use some Plastic Magic. There we go. Right, just leave that to set for a minute and then we'll come back to it. So I'm using 7867 dark blue grey, thinned with water, around about 50-50. It might be a little bit more water to paint, but it's around about 50-50. There we go. We're just going to let that dry. I always think parts like this are the hardest parts to deal with and clean up. Unfortunately, this one is quite thick relatively. Danger is if you don't clean it up properly, when you paint it you can see there's a little bit of a lump, and where you've not sanded down the nub, and it looks a little bit out of shape. So I'm not pressing on, I'm just passing over, and it's a bit time consuming, but at least when we're done, hopefully I won't have snapped it and I won't have flicked it across the room never to be seen again. It is not very spherical though, it's sort of elliptical in shape. So how we glue this on is going to be important. And my thought process here is this is a support, so what we can do is glue it into the bottom here with some super glue, and leave it attached to the seat while we clean up. There we go. So I've popped that in place. That actually looks okay, doesn't it? So it's a good job this plastic's got a bit of flex in, that is tight. So I'm going to put a little bit of, I've got some slow drying black CA. If we put that in, that end first, there we go. And then I'm going to put a little bit more around it, and what that effectively is going to do is glue it in and just act as a little bit of a filler as well. Because the hole, the location hole for this was wider than the actual part. So we'll let that dry, and then we should be able to remove the seat, and hopefully the strut will stay in place, which will allow us to paint all of that, and then we can, when it's all painted up, we can just plop it back in place, all being well. Okay, so the ammunition rack is made of wood also, and this is perhaps the most difficult thing we've had to paint with wood so far. So just like everything else that's wood, it's been given a new wood or a dark wood base coat. I can't remember which one it was, but I think it was new wood because I was trying to go a little bit lighter here. As you can see, we're using the ochre oil brush, which is a nice golden yellow colour. The challenge is that it's perforated, So you've got to paint the actual magazines through those holes. So I decided to do it first and see if we could get away with painting the wood over the top and sort of skim over it and it'd still be okay, knowing that we were going to have to then put some form of shadow effect in. And actually I wasn't far off. The oil brusher process did give a little bit of a build up, but same process as before. Put it on, wipe it off with a bit of packing sponge to give you a sort of grain effect. Once that was done, I've used an earth oil brusher to paint on with a detailing brush some darker notes in terms of the wood grain. The idea here is just to break up the surface a little bit and give you something that's a little bit more recognisable as wood. You've got to remember that you'll only really see this looking down on it. So at this point I thought I needed something just to highlight that it was wood grain a little bit more. So we're putting some darker notes in. Some of them are being blended in with a sponge. Some of them are being left in, but the idea is just to give it a slightly deeper feel than it had with just the ochre effect on it. Once that was done, it was all sealed with a clear coat. I think I used a satin, I don't quite recall now. And then we got the Tamiya black panel line out, and my usual way of working with this is to decant it into a palette because it has quite a whopping big brush on the one that comes in the top, and that's no good for some of this detail. So we just highlighted the grooves between the magazines so that we could clearly see that there were individual items, and then after that we went round all those little perforations in the front of the wood shelf there, which just gives us a final tidy up of the paint effect, and just makes, and it also contrasts the wood a little bit, and just makes everything pop out. So I was pretty happy with it at this point, so this was my final process in painting the magazine rack. So this is the fuel tank bulkhead, and it's basically a panel that spans the two next two bulkheads. So I'm guessing there was a fuel tank behind it on the real aircraft. But we had some details to paint in the Tamiya green that we've used throughout the build so far. So there's some mounting brackets for the ammunition shelf that we've just painted, and some hinges there, and a mounting plate for the fold down chair. So I plan to have the chair up so it was a little bit more visible, and I've been umming and ahhing about whether there needs to be straps. There is no mention of straps, a safety belt or anything like that in the instructions, but it sort of seems obvious that there'd be something, a lap belt maybe, or something or other. I do have some leftover bits from doing the harnesses on the pilot seat, which we'll see later, and I'm still undecided whether I'm going to put something in on this or not, but I do have time to think about it, and it may well be that I attach something to the hinges. Okay, so we've painted our leather little foldable seat in the Vallejo brown. Then we've given it a bit of a dark wash just to bring out the, well, in readiness for bringing out the detail. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to dry brush that and put the light notes of the leather back in. There we go. That's all I'm looking for. Something quite subtle. So that's ready to go in. With all the metalwork now painted up and dried, I was able to go back in and just highlight the details with a wash, again using the modern US vehicles wash, which works nicely with this pale green colour that's being used for the metalwork. This rail that's you just see me painting up and we're just weathering here, ultimately is where all the pilot's gauges get mounted on. Now I made a small error, and we'll talk about that later on. It's only minor, but I deviated from the instructions, and I would recommend you don't deviate from the instructions, but we'll talk about that later on when we come to fit all those gauges. So this is a nice wash for highlighting all of those details. We can just leave it there to dry off. Nothing further more needs to be done with it. So I just need to test fit these magazines on the fuel tank wall. So the other side of this wall is a fuel tank. goes on okay. The bottom of that is open, but you're only going to be able to look down on this, so when you look down on it, it's perfectly fine. So I think we're okay to put some glue into the location holes for that, and that should be sufficient really to hold this. Okay, there we go. So I'm trying to make sure that every panel of wood has a slightly different look to it. I'm managing to achieve it. It's not overly difficult, but at the same time, you do have to be mindful of what you're doing. But we're getting there. So that's my 3 bulkheads ready. Still got the seat to add to that, but paint's drying. But we can now install these really, and then put the seat in afterwards. And then we're going to have to reorganize the sequence of the instructions a little bit, I think.